Revolutionary greetings and revolutionary salutations to you all, our viewers and listeners living and working in different parts of the world. My special guest today is with SOAS University of London, and he's the author of a book that was recently published by Oxford University Press, and it's entitled African Economic Development, Evidence, Theory and Policy. Professor Christopher Cramer, welcome to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful, wonderful. I understand that you wrote this book together with John Sender, who is an emeritus professor of economics at SOAS University of London, and as well as Mr. Oqubay, who is a senior minister and special advisor to the Prime Minister of Ethiopia. When and how did you develop the idea for this book?
The origins of this book go back many, many years. So I think it's important to say that what lies behind this book is decades of teaching for two of us, John Sender and myself, and of policy, direct policy experience on Dr. Oqubay's part. So there are decades of teaching university students in the UK, in South Africa and elsewhere. There are decades of field work, the research that we've done, and there are decades of policy work, so not just Oqubay's direct involvement in policy formulation, but also our own work giving advice to ministries, to ministers, political leaders, teaching economics to Mozambican public officials in the early 90s, to South African officials and so on. But the particular germination of this book was a series of seminars, workshops, if you like, that we ran for the previous Prime Minister of Ethiopia, Haile Mariam Desalegn, which spread over about 3 years, I think, 2014 to 16, roughly speaking. And we would hold these sessions privately in his office, and they were all day long, every day for about 3 days. Very, very intense and wonderful conversations. And we were asked to do this, to design some sort of thematic workshops around economic policy issues and the theories behind them and the evidence and the debates. And it was decided amongst us all that it made sense to try and draw on that as the foundation for what became this book. So that's the story of the book in a way.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you very much for that. Can you just take us through the breakdown of the core ideas of the book and what you consider to be the central argument?
Yeah, I mean, there are many. It's a book that covers a wide range of issues, from poverty and labor issues to macroeconomic and trade policies and so on. So and I would say just a couple of more things to preface the main arguments, or one in particular, that is that we are economists, but we have taken in some ways quite an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary approach to this. So the range of references that we draw on and the types of evidence that we draw on are not restricted to those that maybe more typically characterize sort of dry economics books. In other words, it's not shot full of complex correlation tables and econometrics, but there is the evidence of direct field work, there is comparative statistical work, there is historical evidence, anthropological research, literature evidence, and so on and so forth. So we draw on quite a lot, and I hope that makes it relevant and in some ways quite readable compared to some books, perhaps. So you ask what the main themes and arguments are, and I would highlight maybe 4 or 5. One of them is, and this ought to be obvious, but it's not always, which is evidence. We devote, I think, more time and attention in this book to the question of what evidence there is and where it comes from, its provenance, and its quality and reliability, than is really common to most economics texts. So a lot of technically very sophisticated and impressive works of economics often don't, they're very good with the techniques, but they don't necessarily ask enough about the quality of the underlying evidence. And I think we take that terribly, terribly seriously, because the basis of any claims lies in the evidence and how it's gathered and the gaps and problems with evidence. So that's one very, very important theme in the book. We often reject arguments about labor markets and labor market policy, for example, or poverty, on the grounds, irrespective of their logic and their theory or ideology, on the grounds of the fact that they're based on very, very poor evidence. So that's one big theme throughout the book. A second is a kind of policy, intellectual attitude or stance that we have, and I think runs through many of the arguments of the book, and it's what we call possibilism. It's really about an awareness of the sense of the possible. Possibilism is an idea that we take from a very important and influential economist who, for not all but much of his life, was based in the USA, who was Albert Hirschman. And one way to characterize this argument in favor of possibilism is to contrast it with two alternatives that are very, very common. Reflexes, if you like, intellectually and ideologically through much of the literature on African economic development. And one of those is pessimism, so-called Afro-pessimism. Oh, I'm afraid it's no longer possible. It's not possible because of some ridiculous score on the ethno-linguistic fractionalization index or whatever it might be, or because of proximity to the equator, or etc., etc. Or it's not possible to develop now because the world is a very, very nasty place and there are too many rules that through the WTO or whatever it might be, or phytosanitary standards in export markets for high-value agricultural goods, or because of the way that trade is structured through global value chains. There are many, many sources of pessimism. There always have been. And I think our argument would be that pessimism is often taken too far and denies agency and the possible, and leads you just to sort of almost kind of give up in a way. And the interesting thing is that reflex of pessimism very often characterizes both what you might describe as mainstream, largely neoclassical economists, development economists, and in different ways the work of people who see themselves as very, very much opposed to the mainstream, that is the sort of heterodox left-wing development economists. So many people on both sides of that share a pessimism fundamentally. And then the other thing that we would contrast possibilism with is a different stance, and that's what you might call naive over-optimism. A kind of fantasy that actually, if only you can get rid of a string of ifs, if we can have perfect markets, if we can all be nice to each other and do south-south trade, if this, if that, then everything's terribly easy and will kind of unfold. And so there are these parallel fantasies. Oh, if only we can allocate secure private property rights to everybody, then everybody will become imaginative inventors and innovative investors and entrepreneurs, and everything will just happen very smoothly and in a linear way. And we don't believe that that's how economic history has worked anywhere, really. In fact, I would say that there's a really important theme that runs throughout this book, which is the argument that, and in this there is nothing special about African economies and countries and societies, which is that capitalism and capitalist economic development is always and everywhere, and has always been, and has everywhere been, uneven, contradictory, and brutal. We don't believe in these sort of nice, pretty Whig history versions where all good things go together and so on. So we rather adopt this attitude of possibilism. And one source of possibilism within Africa is to say, well, look, both between countries and within countries, around a given issue, whether it's the availability of contraception to women who want that access, or it's about health care and access in other ways, or trade policy and so on, industrial policy, whatever it might be, there are variations. And those variations between countries, sometimes between quite similar countries, let's say Tanzania, Kenya, Uganda, etc., or its variations within countries, variations are a source of the possible. They give you clues and signals to what might be possible. So that's a really important theme throughout the book. The second or the third theme I would highlight is, and it's related in a way, which is that we embrace imbalance. Many people have a vision of development which is a sort of balanced development. You know, in order to increase supply of this, we must in parallel have more demand of that, and we need to make sure that everything is in place. You often get this idea, many development thinkers think in terms of the preconditions and the prerequisites. You have to have a whole number of things in place first. Good governance, property rights, whatever it may be. And actually, or doing business, you know, nice scores on the World Bank Doing Business Index, whatever it may be. And I think the kind of the lessons of most economic history are, again, that's not how it works. Most economic development, and again, this is a Hirschman theme, tends to be very, very imbalanced. And rather than seeing that necessarily as a terrible problem, because it's, of course, it's difficult, imbalance, is to embrace it and to see the signals within markets and in other institutions that imbalance and things getting out of kilter that actually kind of provoke learning, innovation, new development, so on. Let me finish off with a couple more things that we emphasize throughout the book. If there's an overall sort of economic case that we make, it is a case for the governments of African economies to try to sustain high levels of demand. It's not a supply side recipe book that we have. It's to sustain high levels of demand. Often that's going to have to involve promoting public sector led or supported, at least, investment. That doesn't mean exclusively state-owned enterprises, so on, but public sector-led and supported investment in specific types of activity that need to be prioritized. And the criteria that we emphasize most for prioritizing support for that investment is in those activities most likely to generate foreign exchange earnings, to overcome the balance of payments constraint on development and growth in Africa, and in those activities most likely to generate large amounts of jobs, perhaps specifically for relatively low income people in search and need of wage employment, many of whom are rural women, by the way. There are many other arguments, but they tend to go together. You know, they support that core case. We think it's terribly important to manage food prices, food price inflation, which varies within countries a lot. Within different parts of Zimbabwe, for example, is hugely important politically and economically and just socially. There's a lot of talk these days about expanding infrastructure investment in many African countries. That's a great thing. It's needed. There are big infrastructure gaps. But again, you can't just have a wish list. So the question is aligning that. The question is prioritizing those infrastructure projects most likely to support these strategic priorities in foreign exchange earning and job creation. So I would say those are, without going on too long, those are probably some of the core arguments and themes that we develop.
Wonderful. Thank you very much for that, Professor Christopher. In the context of developing countries, mainly in sub-Saharan Africa, a large number of the population does not have access to some products because of their lack of financial means, primarily because they are poor and they cannot afford to buy food in the supermarket because of inflation. And I can see them as non-consumer according to Clayton Christensen's definition of disruptive innovation. And in light of this, isn't poverty dependent, at least in part, on property rights and on access to the equity in those rights to fund application of mere ideas into funded innovation?
Well, I'm going to upset you by disagreeing with you, and I'm going to say on the first thing that actually most people are consumers. And an interesting thing that many people don't necessarily always realize is that the poorest people throughout sub-Saharan Africa are, when you look closely, they are net purchasers of food, even that, so this idea of self-sufficient rural peasant households doesn't really quite cut the mustard. And so people are, and if you're interested in extreme poverty, which is something that two of us, my colleague John Sender and I, work on a lot at the moment, which is how you might come up with an index of extreme deprivation. That comes closer to what you're talking about, and the people who are really, really poorest tend to be the people who once, and hopefully they've satisfied the very basics of food, of survival, and maybe a roof over their head. What are the first things they spend money on? What are the basic consumer goods that they get? And actually you very quickly see differences emerging. And the most extremely deprived people, who tend to be in rural Africa, they have virtually nothing. So you might be interviewing a young woman, and there's a sense of embarrassment on her face as you realizes, because what people like to do in that situation is they want to bring a chair or a bench for you to sit on outside her hut. She had nothing. An empty hut, not a single consumer good in there. That is extreme poverty. So, but most people, even very, very poor people who would fall probably below the standard poverty lines, they will have a small number of basic consumer goods. But your issue, so that's a very complicated issue that you touch on, to do with consumption, and a really important one. But I think, to put it provocatively, the idea that if we just could assign secure private property rights to everybody, then they would unleash their imaginative powers and become innovators and investors, is a nice idea. More than that, it's a lovely idea, but I think it's a romantic idea. And I think it's an ahistorical idea as well. In terms of poverty reduction, how have most people escaped extreme deprivation and poverty historically, whether it's in England or it's in China or it's in Ethiopia or South Africa? It's through access to jobs. It's through wage employment. So yes, you need the innovators and the investors, but for the majority of people, the route out of poverty is through wage employment, and always has been. And there are expanding wage labor markets across Africa, and that's a very important thing to try and understand more about. I think the other thing that's missing about property rights, well, two more things that are missing. One is that for people to be able to invest and to try and realize their ideas and entrepreneurial ambitions and so on, you need demand. It comes back to what I was arguing earlier. just having an idea, or these countless NGO projects for kind of which end up, there are apocryphal and there are real stories, sort of projects creating people, the poultry projects, so that women are breeding chickens and selling eggs to other people who are also part of the project. And it's just there's not large enough demand for what they're doing. So it comes back to that demand side. I think at another and higher level, it's important also to realize historically that huge amounts of invention and innovation, of investment, and of economic development and structural change have come about in the context of very messy property rights regimes. The idea that property rights were really inclusive and secure at a private level everywhere as a precursor to economic development and poverty reduction, it doesn't really fit the historical record. And even if we think in recent global economic history, where has growth been most extraordinary? Where has the rate of poverty reduction been most astonishing? China. Mm-hmm. Does everybody have clear private property rights in China? No.
No, it's not. Yeah.
Where's the fastest economic growth in Africa in the last 20 years? Where's the fastest rates of poverty reduction in Africa in the last 20 years? Probably in Ethiopia. Mm. The state owns all the land. So we have to think very, very kind of carefully about these property rights issues. I'm not writing them off, but I think there's a number of things like that where one has to be very, very careful about kind of a nice liberal idea like having property rights in place first. Mm-hmm. You think of Nollywood in Nigeria. Nollywood is a massive success story. It developed at first and expanded precisely in conditions of property rights insecurity. Mm. So later on, when the market got underway and people got better and better at making these films in Nigeria, and the demand was there and there was more investment, then people started to say, hang on, we need better institutions. For this market really to be consolidated, it was people that then went to states within Nigeria and said, you have to enforce the rules and the property rights a bit better and stop the pirating of the videos and so on. But it was exactly the lack of clear private property rights and security that actually provided the spark for the innovation in Nollywood. So it's the reality of historical development like that is far messier, more contradictory and uneven than this idea that first you get everything right. First you get a nice score on the Doing Business Index. First you have private property rights. No, the reality is messier than that.
It is widely recognized that donor intervention in fragile states circumvents the state systems by delivering through non-state actors such as non-governmental organizations. And examples include countries like the Democratic Republic of Congo, the Central African Republic, and South Sudan, among many other countries. Is it the role of non-governmental organizations to provide things like healthcare, education, water, sanitation, and food and other services as part of a permanent or sustainable solution to fragility? And under what circumstances can aid strengthen institutional capacities in African fragile states?
Enormous questions. Those are really, really big ones. The short answer is no. NGOs are not the long-term solution to these issues. There are many things that some NGOs do that are fantastic, and there are wonderful people across the world working in them. But as a solution to the long-run issues of education, healthcare, developing a social contract as well as social services, that has to really rely on the evolution of states. So that the problem in some of those countries, I don't really like this classification of fragile states and stuff. I think it's very difficult to sustain. But I know the places that you're talking about, and I think the kind of trap that evolves in some of them is it's a bit like we think in terms of COVID terms. We think of ICUs. It's like an intensive care unit, and what happens is that there's a kind of balanced ecosystem whereby the NGOs are keeping the thing alive by, as you say, by providing some of these services. They sometimes don't do that very well. This is when we talk about fragile states, we need to ask about the fragility of NGOs too. They're often under-resourced. They often don't really do their monitoring and evaluation very, very well. They're sometimes rather fickle and faddish in what it is they're interested in, despite there being, marvelous people often doing very fantastic things. So, but the problem is it keeps enough people with a sort of a, somebody put it to me this way, talking about one such country that you've mentioned in particular, that what it does is it gives enough people a stake in the system kind of carrying on, that they don't actually take up arms and start a new war and so on. So it keeps the thing ticking over in intensive care, but there's no real incentive for the state to kind of develop its institutions of taxation, of governance, and so on. And it means that a lot of people can happily carry on not investing because it's too uncertain. And if they have wealth to save and invest, what they do is they'll save it elsewhere in foreign bank accounts and so on. So it's not really moving. It's a sort of static trap that happens, and I think that is the great difficulty that people haven't yet quite come up with the solution to. Fundamentally, over the long run, that solution is going to have to come out of internal politics, for which is very difficult to kind of model, if you like. I know there are some people like Alex de Waal who argue that, for example, in the Horn of Africa, what he calls the political marketplace logic has taken over the whole of politics and more or less characterizes it as the whole of politics. But that's historical. It's contingent. It's not always the same. It's not always the case everywhere. But so I think that, history is a slow-moving thing, and it doesn't move in straight lines. But I think the solution to that ultimately comes from within rather than from out.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Professor Christopher Cramer. Viewers and listeners, this was Professor Christopher Cramer. A copy of his book, African Economic Development, Evidence, Theory and Policy, can be accessed on the link that I'm going to paste on the description panel on the upload for this video, and right in the comment section on our Facebook page. The other authors of this book include Professor John Sender and as well Mr. Akebe Oqubay. Their biographies are also going to be shared right in the description panel on the upload for this video. Professor Christopher, I'm happy to have heard you. Thank you very much for the time.
Thank you very much. Very nice to meet you and to be on your show. Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a good day.
You too. Take care.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.